Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to make this Father's Day card, so stick with me for all the steps. First of all, what you want to do is take some watercolour card, and we're going to take some high-tack tape. Now it's important that you use something like high-tack tape for this one, because what you want to do is have the paper really adhered to your mat or whatever it is you're using. Because when you add colour to watercolour card, it can sometimes bow, which is fine. It's not a problem, you know, naturally does that, but it's just easier if you adhere it down to your workspace. And then that kind of gives you that little extra help to keep it flat. So nearly there, just do all the sides. Now for this particular card, we don't need the whole of the paper to be covered. But it is recommended, I think, if you are going to do it, try and cover as much as possible, because that means then when you go to cut the piece that you actually want to use, you've got a few options for which part of that card you like the best of the look. And then we're going to go for some watercolour cards here, watercolour pens to go onto the card. And this is a really simple way of doing it. You literally just want to add some of that colour to the card. You don't have to be too sort of precious about how it looks, because that's the whole idea of a watercolour technique, is that it's kind of slushy and not too precise. So we're just going to add that watercolour down. Don't worry if your colours mix up either, because again we are going for that washy watercolour look. So we're just going to add these colours. Obviously if you want a little bit more of one colour or anything like that, you can add more of one colour. But we're just going to go all the way down to the bottom, so we've got a nice full line of colour. And as you can see, I've missed a few spaces. You could go back in and sort of fill those out if you wanted to. It doesn't have to be completely covering, because what we're going to do, we're almost going to flood that paper just to get that colour going. And one little bit here. There we go. And then what you're going to do, either sort of flick some water over with your fingers or whatever, but I find it easier just to use a spritz bottle, because it really does get that water down sort of much quicker than me trying to add it with a brush or something. So once you've sort of really got that watercolour, you can actually see it there, it popped up. That's the watercolour sort of reacting to the water. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to get our paintbrush here, and we're kind of going to mix it up so we really get that sloshy look. And what happens is, obviously what you can do is you can add a little bit more water if you want to get that colour moving, whatever works, you know, sort of what you want it to look like. But try and get those colours sort of mixing together, creating a really sort of slushy look. Just get that tape to stick down there. And what you can do if you want to is just bring in a wet wipe or a tissue or something like that, just to get some of that colour off the paintbrush, because you'll see that what's happening here, because the blue is the darkest of the colours, it's really sort of present. So I just want to get a little bit more of that green showing, so I can get some of that green off. And then finally just mix in, just add a little bit more of that yellow, I think, here. So we want to just have that defined look. Clean that brush off again, just keep taking off that excess watercolour. And then we're happy. So we've got coverage there, and we're happy with what it looks like. Now what I would recommend is, I would recommend leaving this to completely dry. And then what you're going to do is, once it's completely dry, I would also recommend, because as you can see just from the look of the card, you've got a slightly bowing look there. I would recommend maybe some heavy books or something like that, just to cover it, to make it completely flat. So I'm just going to pop that to one side while it dries. And what you'll see here is, now I've cut a drier piece down to size, and you can see all the definition in the colours. Again, what I can recommend, if you think that once it's dried that maybe you want a little bit more of that blue, or you want some more of that green, you can add a little bit more of the watercolour, get it wet again and get that colour moving again. It's never really complete. You know, if you just add water, it will start to react again. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to emboss some clear embossing onto our little strip of colour here. Now what I've got is, I've got a little, it's sort of my emboss kit, and I would recommend you having something like this. It just makes less mess. I just use a little box to put that in, and I'm just going to put some copier paper down, or just any kind of paper, just so that you can fold that away. and you can get it out of the way. And I'm going to pop my little strip inside. Now what you want to do when it comes to embossing, it can be rather static, and so the embossing powder can stick to parts that you didn't want it to stick to. So this is just a little bit of static powder just to add on to this. Just brush some of that away, but what it means is the embossing powder will only stay where you want it to. And then we're going to take our stamps here. And what we're going to do for speed, I'm actually just going to put the two stamps together and kind of create my own little background whilst having the stamps together. Otherwise, if I went in, because it's clear embossing, you can't see the image directly. It's sort of slightly almost like a watermark. And so what I do is if I put them both on the same platform, it means that I can create the background without going over the top of what I've already stamped. So you can see there, the stamping kind of comes up. So you get a kind of look of why it's come up so dark is because you've got that powder on there. And we can just keep, just put a little bit more on the smaller welly boots. We can just keep creating our pattern all the way down, sort of however you want to. You can also have pieces like here where you can have the stamp coming off. It doesn't have to be fully on the page. And then what we're going to do, so we're happy with that, we're going to come in with our clear embossing. Now what I like to do is just have a little pot here. You can see there's some in there already, and I just kind of lay it underneath, and what that means is it kind of catches any excess, so you're not wasting you're going to end up wasting a little bit because these things happen, but it means you're not wasting too much. And then you're going to come in with your embossing powder, and you're just going to go over the top of those images. Just cover them. You can see already that embossing is covering the stamps we've done. Just turn it round. There we go, and just try and cover all those pieces. If you need to, like there where I've missed a little piece, you can go back in with just some more powder and get the little bits that you've missed. And there, I can see just on that little part of the boot there, I've missed a piece. I can go in and fill that in because you know what the image is supposed to look like. Then I'm finished here. Now, as I said, I've got this little pot here, and later on, I'll just pour that back into the embossing pot, and I can use it again on a different project. And it means that there's very, very little waste. I'm not wasting too much of my embossing powder. I'm just going to pop that to one side because we've finished with that now, and we can start heat embossing. Now when it comes to heat embossing, you want your gun to be quite warm before you put it on, because you've also got to be prepared that the more you heat a piece of paper, the more bowed it's going to become. So keep that heat on for a few minutes just to sort of get that heat working in the gun before you bring it to your paper. But also, as before with the watercolour, I would recommend maybe after you've embossed it and you've let it completely dry, pop it underneath a book or something like that just to flatten that out. So we'll just take a few moments to get this heat gun really warm before we introduce it to our paper. But you can see here where I haven't got any of the excess embossing powder, where I didn't want it because I used that static bag. So that's a really good idea to have that in your stash for when you need it. Okay, so I think we're quite warm now. So what you'll see straight away, if we've got it warm enough, straight away that embossing powder will start to go clear. So what I'm going to do is actually just bring it in to the darker blue so I can really see what's happening. I would also recommend, if you're doing heat embossing, to hold it away from your desk slightly, because if you leave it on the desk and you try and heat emboss, what happens is the heat has to go through the paper and the desk at the same time, so it takes slightly longer to heat emboss. So we're going to see how we're doing. Already you can see that's starting to go. Whoop, let's just move it over slightly. There, straight away, you can see that that was long enough, because already that white is now disappearing and it's turning clear. And we've got our cute little picture. As you can see that it's slightly warping. That is what happens unfortunately sometimes. But as I say with the tip before, if you just pop it under something to flatten it out, it'll be really easy to flatten it back to straight again. And we're nearly there. Just try not to hold it too long over the top of one image. And there we go, we've got our heat embossing. So what we're going to do now, I'm just going to give that a few seconds just to cool down. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to bring in our wet wipe. And as I said to you, the watercolour will be reactive to water. So I'm quite enjoying how this looks up here, but we're not seeing as much of the boots down below. So what you can do, once you've completely got that dry, you're just going to go in and we can start to pull away some of that colour. But what you'll find is that clear embossing is actually creating almost a resist. So the nice darker colour will stay underneath. See, I can go over that several times and nothing's going to come up. It's going to stay the same colour. But you can see here I'm just wiping a little bit of colour away. So we're getting to see more of the image underneath. But that resist is working on the embossing, so it's not doing anything to the actual boots. There we go. So we're happy with how that looks, and we can start building our card. Right, now don't worry about that. What's happened is I've got a little bit of water from that spray on my background, but it's okay because we're going to be able to cover that, no problem. We're just going to add a little bit of our colour, our watercolour pens here. We're going to add a little bit of water again. Now what's quite nice is because we know these are the colours, we know that everything's going to work together. So we're just going to add a little bit of colour here and tap onto our, we can add a bit more, get that colour really juicy, get our paintbrush really covered, and there you go, you get some really nice splodges of colour that kind of just give that little bit more depth. And you can really do as much of that or as little as that if you want. I kind of like it, sometimes having too much white on a card can be quite sort of stark, and so I like to have a little bit of the paint to do that. Right. And then we're just going to take our stamp here and line it up on our stamping platform. Again, if you're someone who doesn't like to stamp too much, you find it a bit too tricky, you're worried about it not being straight or anything, you can always use a precision press, but I kind of think as long as I've got it lined up pretty well before I stamp, it can look okay. So we're just going to line this up. Again, what's wonderful, if you have one of these mats, to use the grid just to keep your image straight. We're just going to pop that down, give it a little bit of a wiggle to cover all the corners, and it goes down pretty easily. You don't have to worry. I'm not amazing at stamping, but I think as long as you give that little bit of a wiggle before you lift it off, it will help you to stamp it properly. And then what we've got here is a little bit of twine, and I also had some dies here, which I had some of the waste of the inked background, and we can create a little sort of sentiment to go. It's always great. I'm one of those people who has a lot of waste card bits that I've cut off because I always find a use for it. You just never know what you're going to use that for. So just have a little box of waste paper, and you can use that at a later date. So we're just going to use some wet glue to pop that down. We've got our little boots here to match our Father's Day boots. Again, using that watercolour image, so we know that it all sort of goes together and matches. Once you've put down the other pieces, so say once you've put down your strip here, if you find that you want to add a little bit more of the splattering, that's fine. I would say just do it before you adhere it to the card, because you might end up getting some of it on the card blank, which actually might look quite cool, but I think just do that before you put it all together. And then we're just going to take some of our twine here. And I've just got some red liner tape just to adhere it to the back. Just going to take that off. Quite easy to get that off. We're going to add our string to the back, and what I want to do is I'm just going to see from the front where I want it, so take it all the way round and just cross at some point where you know it's not going to be covered, and then you can stick that down. Now the thing about having twine is then I would always recommend to use foam tape or something to adhere this to the card, because that's going to cause a little bit of a ridge. Right, we've got our red liner tape. Now as you can see, this is still quite bobbly from taking that colour off. And if you found that you've put it under the books and it's still a little bit bobbly, what I would recommend is actually to adhere it to the card with some red liner tape, because it's a really solid adhesive and it's going to really hold it in place. So we're just going to lay that down. Just going to make that so it's nice and adhered to the card before I take the layer off. You could also use a bone folder for this, just sort of go over the top, and once it's got slightly that darker red, it will mean that the top layer is going to come off much easier. So just make sure that red liner tape is really stuck down before you try and take the cover off. Just a little bit more. There we go. Just going to lay that down, like so. Just bring this in to take some of it off. There we go, just line it up nicely. Don't have to be too precise about measurements, it's just giving it that slight border, which helps you to see the image a little bit more clearly. And then, again, like I say, I'm going to use foam tape or foam pads, because I want to make sure that we don't get that ridge there on the twine. So just line it up, see where we can get to, it's about right. Okay. And then just line it up with that little bit of a border on the side. And like I say, you can still see some of the paint, but if you wanted to, you could easily go in and splodge a little bit more on. It's up to you. And I'm going to use foam pads on the back of this as well to adhere it to the card. Just a nice bit of depth and dimension, but also hiding that little bit of the ridge at the back. And there we go. Quite an easy technique, but you get quite a different sort of look with that clear embossing powder and that clear embossing. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more crafty tips and card inspiration.